The bad news, I guess, is I've only got 3 more points to this sermon. Good news is they're not long ones, so maybe that can help a little bit after that delicious lunch. I do appreciate our ladies so much. I do, not just because they cook for our all-in-ones, but they do so much work behind the scenes and rarely get recognized or thanked. But I'll guarantee you they are the heartbeat of this congregation, and just really appreciate them, everything they do. All right, so we're looking at Acts chapter 8 and talking about the idea of evangelism in the early church. We've covered several points, but I want to continue on with some of the things that Philip did in interacting with the Ethiopian eunuch that I think we can take and incorporate into our lives and certainly help us to better evangelize as God has commanded us to do. The first thing that I want to mention this afternoon is that he used the scriptures. And here's what I kind of want you to be thinking a little bit about too. I didn't say that he quoted the scriptures, but that he used them. And so it's kind of interesting when you read about him in verse 35 there in Acts chapter 8, it says, "Then Philip opened his mouth and beginning at the scripture, preached unto him Jesus." Philip's conversation with the eunuch began about a certain passage in the book of Isaiah. Specifically, it's found in Isaiah chapter 53, if you want to go over there and kind of look at it and talk or think about some of the things that that passage has to say about Jesus Christ. But I bring that up because I think a lot of times when we enter into a religious conversation or discussion with people, we got to be careful that we speak to them in terms that they can understand. And I think sometimes, especially if we've grown up in the church, we probably take for granted that everybody knows what we're talking about when we use certain religious terms. But imagine yourself, you're a person who's never read the Bible, never been part of an organized religion or church. I mean, how much would you know and how much would you really understand? And so I think in those instances, you got to be careful when you're talking to people to speak to them in terms that they can understand. And I would also encourage us to do this. Like I said, some of this is, I don't say a lot, but some of this is my personal opinion. If you think it's good, use it. If you don't like it, throw it in the trash. You got one, I got one too, and it might help you, it might not. But if you are going to read specifically from the Bible, I would say this: choose your passages carefully. Choose passages that are very easy and straightforward for people to understand. And sometimes that may incorporate the idea of maybe even using a different version or translation. You don't have to do that if that's not your preference. But I think whenever you study the Bible, one of the things that you learn is that God wanted his word to be put into modern language that people could easily understand. And so I think when we speak to people about Christ and we tell them about the gospel, it's important that we speak to them in terms that they can understand. And that might not necessarily mean quoting scripture per se, but you can certainly use scripture. You can certainly talk about the explanation of a passage. You can say, like, in this particular verse, Acts chapter 8, verse 26, here's what happened. And so I think it's important to understand not everybody is as familiar with the Bible and familiar with religious terms as we are. And I think one of the easiest things that you can do probably for somebody, if you're speaking to somebody who does not know the Bible, does not have a religious background, I think one of the easiest things that you could probably do is use a tract. A tract is it's colorful, it'll hold your attention, but it also uses key scriptures in a way that people can understand them. And the good thing about a tract is this: after you use it, you can hand it to them and say, hey, you can take this home with you, and you can read it and study it a little bit more. But that can be an extremely effective means in certain situations. And so here's what I would encourage us: even though we may not use the exact words of a certain Bible or a certain Bible translation or verse, the ultimate goal is to have that person accept the truth. And I've said this before, but I'll say it again. I don't believe what version you use determines your beliefs. There are some people who do believe that, but that's not certainly one that I would hold fast to. So he used the scriptures, and so we've got to use the scriptures too. There's various ways that you can do that, various means that you can do that. The second thing that I want for us to think about this afternoon is his goal in this conversation was to spark a response from the Ethiopian eunuch. And I think that's a good thing for us to think about too in our religious discussions with other people too. You know, sometimes I think we get so wrapped up in wanting to prove ourselves right and other people wrong that we forget the whole point of this conversation is to try to invoke some kind of response from them in obedience to the gospel of Jesus Christ. And so we may win an argument, yeah, but did we bring a soul to Christ? That's the goal, isn't it? And when we think about that idea, what do we want them to understand? We want them to understand that there's a response that they need to have to this message that they're hearing. And when you read about the Ethiopian eunuch, he recognized that, didn't he? In fact, if you look at verse 36 in Acts chapter 8, it says, "Now as they went down the road, they came to some water, and the eunuch said, 'See, here is water. What hinders me from being baptized?'" As Philip spoke to the Ethiopian eunuch, he realized that the message that was being relayed to him demanded a response. And he recognized that he was the one who had to make a response to the message that he had just heard. And so when they came to some water, he suggested that Philip baptize him. And if you look throughout all the evangelistic situations in the Bible, especially in the book of Acts, you'll see they may not specifically call upon a person to respond, but you'll see at the very least in these interactions that it is implied that there's something that they have to do because they've heard this message. And so whenever we speak to others about Christ, that should be our goal. We want them to respond to the gospel message that they hear. We want them to understand that there's something that they must do in order to obey the gospel in order to be saved. That does not necessarily mean that every time that we talk to somebody that we should press them for a decision. I don't think that's what the Bible implies at all as you read through the book of Acts. But I think here's what should happen. At least whenever they leave that conversation, they should leave with an impression that they need to make a decision, that there's something that they have to do upon their part. And so when we speak to somebody about the gospel of Christ, when we share our faith, we need to aim at the idea that they need to understand, I have to respond in some way to this message. The last thing that I'm going to mention here this afternoon is this. He converted him as soon as he was ready. And this might be a little bit of a controversial topic in the Lord's church today, but I think it's at least worthy of our consideration as we read this particular account of a conversion. Now notice, I didn't say as soon as the Ethiopian eunuch wanted, although in this situation that was how it played out, but as soon as he was ready, he baptized him or he converted him. And so here's a couple things that I want us to think about real quickly here this afternoon. I think in speaking with people, especially preachers, especially long members, people have been members of the Lord's church for a long time. That's what I was trying to say there. Not tall, but the length of duration. People who have been members of the Lord's church for a long time, they often ask this question. They say, well, or they might say, I just don't know if they know enough to be baptized yet. And so I think in our minds, we develop this idea and this checklist. This person needs to know this and this and this and this and this before they're ready to be baptized. And one of the things that I've often seen in this, I talked a little bit about the evangelistic programs and the evangelistic material that we have today, is this long, drawn-out process that sometimes is supposed to cover months and months of Bible study. I want you to read the book of Acts, and I want you to think about how quickly people were converted in the book of Acts. The Ethiopian eunuch is a prime example of this thing. Now, let me be clear. There are certain things that a person needs to know before they're ready to be baptized. There's no doubt about that. But again, if you look and you read these stories, Philip preached Jesus to this Ethiopian eunuch, and he said, here's water, can I be baptized? And you know what Philip says? He says, do you believe that Jesus Christ, do you believe with all your heart that Jesus is the Christ? He said, I do. And he baptized him. Now, here's something again to think about. I'm not going to talk about what it means to preach Jesus, because like I said, that's my next sermon, so I'm going to save it for that. But for now, let me just suggest this. He told him about the man that he was reading about in Isaiah chapter 53. Wouldn't you agree with that? That's what that whole discussion was about. And as he was telling him about this man, he obviously told him, in fact, that he died for his sins. He obviously told him about what he needed to do in order to have those sins forgiven. And so as they were reading about in the book of Isaiah and studying from it, he saw some water and he says, hey, can I be baptized? Am I ready? And what did he say he needed to know? Well, he said, do you believe that Jesus Christ, you believe that with all your heart, that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God? He said, yes, and he baptized. Now, let me ask you this. Did he have a lot more to learn? Well, sure. I mean, there was plenty more for him to learn. Did he need to be followed up with after he was baptized? Yeah, absolutely he did. But the basic instructions of Christianity had been taught to him. And after you teach somebody the basic instructions of Christianity, they're ready to be baptized. And Philip did it. Now, again, study the book of Acts. If you don't believe that's the case, immediate baptism after basic instruction seems to have been the pattern throughout the book of Acts. Let me remind you of this, too. A lot of these people were pagans. A lot of these people had about zero background in Christianity, knowledge about the Bible, who Jesus is, who God is, things like that. Yet, it's almost like in one small session, they were taught the basics of Christianity and they obeyed the gospel on the spot. It wasn't this process that was drawn out for weeks and months and hours of study. And so he baptized him as soon as he was ready. Now, what does that mean for us today? Well, if you're the one doing the baptizing, you're the one who has to answer to God. So I'm not going to tell you what to do and what not to do. But I would just encourage you to think about the records of conversion that we have throughout the book of Acts. I'm going to close with this idea this afternoon. And this is kind of I guess maybe a word of encouragement for us. Don't focus solely upon the person being getting baptized or being converted. And I want to explain what I mean by that particular statement. There's this perception. You know, perception is the way that we see things or view things versus the reality of how they are. And I think what we have with the idea of the perception or our perception of evangelism is we think that if you didn't convert somebody, you didn't evangelize them. Well, that's not the truth of the matter, is it? Now, that's our aim. That's our goal in evangelizing. We want somebody to obey the gospel. We want them to be converted. But our job is not necessarily to convert them. Our job is to tell them the story of Jesus. It's up to them to decide what they're going to do with that story, and it's up to them to give a response. We can't force people to obey the gospel. That's a choice that they have to make themselves. That's something that's beyond our control and beyond our ability. And so when we think about evangelism, I think the misperception that we have is if you don't convert them, you've been unsuccessful. That's not true. We've evangelized like the Lord told us to do. We've done our part. And I love the way that Paul puts it in 1 Corinthians 3 and verse 6. He said, I planted, Apollos watered, God gave the increase. And that's the way that we need to think about evangelism. Evangelism, our part is planting and watering. And sometimes we're planting the seed. Sometimes we're talking to somebody who's never heard the gospel before. We plant the seed. Sometimes we're watering the seed. Sometimes they've heard about it and they've talked to other people before, and we're just coming along pouring some more water on the seed. You know, here's what I've learned through the years about farming. I can plant the seed. You can have a garden, you can water it, but you know what I can't do? I can't make that seed grow. That's not my job. That's God's job. And only God can do it. My job is to plant. My job is to water. God gives the increase. And if you plant and if you water, you've done what God asked you to do. That is evangelism. Again, it doesn't mean we don't care whether a person is converted or obeys the gospel. We care about that. It just means that we're responsible for sharing the good news, and then we leave the outcome in the hands of God. Maybe there's somebody here in our audience this afternoon who's not a child of God, and you desire to become one. If that's your case, we want to encourage you to do that at this time. If you've already made that commitment and you've not been living faithfully, and you need to make some changes in your life, acknowledge sin of a public nature, we'll certainly help you all we can with that too. Any way we can help you this afternoon, won't you please come forward while together we all stand and sing.